mentioned throughout the course. If you do have any questions, very interactive, please utilize the question and answer section. If it is relevant to the current slide, I will be addressing it right then and there. If it's perhaps relevant to later on in the presentation and the course, I'll cover it then. And if not, I will have some time at the end to answer any more specific situations as well, or specific scenarios. Now, it's really interesting in terms of the dental office lease. We've been around for 26 years now and was originally founded by dentists for dentists because of this issue, where dentists unfortunately have been taken advantage of as tenants since time, where they've unfortunately signed or gotten themselves into situations where they've either had a poor agreement in place, whether they've missed certain deadlines, have been taken advantage of, whether they are overpaying in rent or leveraged in different situations for other monetary values. There's a variety of different situations that have occurred, and many on this webinar today, whether they've experienced them personally or have experienced them through a colleague or a friend, or whether it's a study club as well. These are unfortunately situations that not only happen throughout California or Hawaii, but actually across North America as well. And so today there are going to be a number of different items that we're going to go through, but welcome to the course on negotiating or renegotiating the terms and rent in your dental office lease post-COVID-19. We're also going to discuss how the landscape has changed as well. Now I have three numbers to start off with: 85, 54, and 80. 85, 54, and 80. %85 of dentists have a lease that can prevent them from ever selling their practice. 54% of dentists across North America are overpaying in rent for their practice. And I'm not just saying they feel like they're overpaying, they are overpaying. And 80% of landlords structure the lease to give them a right to at least 50% of the proceeds when a practice is sold, meaning the landlord receives 50% of the sale proceeds when the practice is sold. 85, 54, and 80. Now, I think it's important before we go through further through the program to know a little bit about us. Who we are, what we do, how we support the dental community, to really understand the knowledge that we have in the real estate market. So for everyone's benefit, for those who are maybe perhaps unfamiliar with us, we are a healthcare and dental specialized tenant representation firm. We're founded by dentists for dentists in 1994, so actually celebrating our 26th anniversary this year. We've negotiated over 12,000 dental and medical office leases across North America. What really makes us unique, though, is we have everything in-house, where we have an in-house legal team comprised of highly experienced real estate attorneys and lease negotiators with a background of healthcare and tenant representation. We have an in-house leasing team that have access to rental rates and comparables in any given market, as well as our proprietary data, so doctors we've worked with nearby. And we have an in-house consulting team that essentially work alongside the legal and leasing teams to really help develop a strategy for the negotiation. So this way, we're able to support our clients from not only a financial standpoint in the negotiations, but a legal standpoint as well. But on an annual basis, we represent a little over 500 doctors throughout North America. And we deliver over 100 of these continuing education accredited seminars annually. Now, in many cases, they've been a mix between seminars in person or via webinars similar to today, or through various other study clubs, lunch and learns, and venues of that nature as well. We lecture at most of the major dental conventions, such as the Greater New York, Pacific Dental, the Yankee Dental, and of course, as many of you are familiar with, the California Dental Association, who truly work with dentists nationwide. Now, the purpose of today's webinar. So Eric alluded to some of the items that we're covering today, but to give you a bit of an itinerary through this process, we're going to go through an update on some of the market rental rate trends that you've seen throughout both California and Hawaii as well, and some of the different impacts that COVID has had throughout. A lot has changed, as I'm sure many of you have realized, through the real estate market, particularly on rental rates and comparables, as markets are not the same as they were pre-COVID. Secondly, the importance of an office lease agreement and how they could impact you. Why are they relevant? A few key terms and conditions within your office lease. And finally, so that way everyone has a takeaway from today's webinar, is some practical advice on negotiating lease agreements, some tips and tricks of the trade, if you will, to help put yourself in a position of success for the negotiations. Now, in terms of some market updates, so in San Diego, now keep in mind, rental rates can change and alter based on each block, each type of property, whether it's Class A, B, Class C, what type of anchor tenants there are, the demand in a very specific particular area. So to give you an idea, I mean, San Diego's rental rates have a very wide range. They're near La Jolla above, or if you're right in, if you're downtown, if you're down near the waterfront, things of that nature as well. Now, these market rental rates, you'll notice on the right-hand side, where California is very interesting and different from the rest of the country, is these are all in a per square foot on a yearly basis. Now, in California, you may be thinking, these seem awfully high. It's because these are on a year per square foot. We're not looking at a per square on a monthly basis, which is the typical. So as part of these rental rates, we have to do the conversions ourselves. So if you look and review the blue rental rate line or the blue line rather, is the market rent. So it is just below $3 a square foot and increasing. So there was a dip through COVID, and now as you'll see, it's increasing again. Now this is typical of a supply and demand type of chart, which I'm sure many of you might be, at least at a high level, familiar with at some point in your life. And if not a problem. I'll give you the general rule of thumb for it. Typically, as supply decreases, the increase in demand, which means rental rates are increasing because there's less available on the market. Typically, when supply increases and there are more vacancies and an increased amount, because there's more vacancies and availability, demand decreases for a particular space, and so does rent. Now, the interesting component, which you'll notice on many of these charts, is that even though the supply is increasing, so are rental rates as well. Now, typically, I ask this in my seminar when I'm hosting in person, whether it's been in San Diego about a year ago, it was just in Burlingame and Sunnyvale in February. But in terms of these components, has your rent ever decreased in the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years? So that's where it's critical to ensure your lease is structured properly for that, which we'll go through a few different items in a minute. In Irvine, you'll notice it's a bit stronger of a dip. So it was up closer to a little higher than $3 a square foot throughout 2019, a slight drop through 2020, then significant as COVID has hit through it. But you'll notice all of the forecasts of where the market's trending is recovering very quickly. Woodland Hills, very similar. So you'll notice that the market trends for rental rates, which is the blue line again, is increasing in every single chart. California and Hawaii are some of the hottest real estate markets throughout the country. This is why. Even though, for example, in Los Angeles, the vacancy rate are nearly 11%, about 10.7%. And yet rental rates are still up about the $3 a square foot range. In Oakland, very similar. In East Bay, you're looking about another $3.50 a square foot and continue to rise. Santa Clara. And I won't belabor the points through this as you'll notice the trend in each one. San Francisco, taking nearly a full dollar per square foot decrease through mid-2019 and is projected to continue through to mid-2001. Now, very similar, slightly over $3 a square foot. In Honolulu, I get about $3.50 a square foot, even though the vacancies has significantly increased. So what this has showed is rental rates have not been going where everyone thinks and believes, but this has also proven to be an opportune time to address these items, as there are other types of businesses that are vacant in the building and landlords needing to secure leases and long-term leases. So we found through COVID now, with this particular time, has this been a phenomenal time to address these types of items in the lease, and not just for the short term, but for the long term as well. Now, this is a question I'm asked regularly. Should I buy a property or should I lease a property, Ryan? I need some guidance here. And there's never a right answer in terms of you should do one or the other, because it all depends on the individual and the plan. But what I encourage and help educate is ask them the questions many others are not asking. But let's take a look at it. There's pros and cons of each. If you're looking to buy a property, it requires a larger upfront financial investment, which means there's less capital if you're looking to perhaps spend more for higher quality products in the dental practice, or open up multi-locations because you have more capital tied up in your property investment. You become a landlord. So many don't realize this, but it's like a second job. You're not only the owner of a small business, being a practice, but you're also the owner of a property. If the toilet breaks, guess who gets to call the plumber? Or if you're handy yourself, you might have to be the one to bring the plunger. Earn rental income. So it's one of the pros as well. So if it's a single tenant or multi-tenant property, you could be deriving rental income. Or if it's a single tenant, maybe eventually you look to sell the practice, but hold on to the real estate. Greater flexibility on how to use the space. You're the boss. You own the property. You own the practice. You get to choose how you'd like to use it. And the freedom to control the property. If you want to make additions to the building or to the parking lot, or structural changes to the space, you don't need to seek permission from the property owner. Now, what are some of the pros and cons about leasing? That requires a smaller upfront payment, so more capital to work with. To the next point, greater working capital towards building out the practice, or if you're looking at multi-locations or multiple locations, very similar, and the flexibility to relocate or expand. There was a doctor just about, I want to say last year, was in a small town that unfortunately had been just hit hard by the economy, was not growing, was slowing down, and now he had to practice to the neighboring town. But unfortunately, he owned the property. So now he has capital built into that component and is stuck. But what do these both have in common? The dental office lease. So what is a lease? So I typically ask this in our seminar to get a bit of opinion back. Now, as this is a one-way webinar, this is the first thing that everybody thinks of. Everyone thinks of rent. A lease is the relationship that ties the tenant and the landlord to that space. Now, it's typically attached to a 30, 40, 50, 60-page document. But most only read the first page. Why? Because the only things that they think they care about is term and how much money they're paying each month. The key is what most don't realize, whether you're acquiring a practice or starting up and building out the practice from scratch, you're not just committing to $5,000 a month, $6,000 a month. Most practices don't look to relocate through their career if they don't have to. So you're not only investing into that space, again, whether acquiring or starting up for $5,000 a month, for example, you're investing into that space $5 a month for the course of the term. So if it's a 10-year term and there's typically escalations each year, you're not just investing into that $5,000 a month. That's $5,000 a month for 12 months, which is $60,000. If you're doing it over the course of 10 years, again, we're going to just assume for this example that there's no increases, which as many of you doesn't happen. So over the course of 10 years, that's $600,000. If you stay there for 30 years, again, assuming no increases, that's $1.8 million that you've invested into the landlord. That's why for dentistry, when you sign your first lease, it is the most expensive check you will ever write. You've just learned the first major negotiating point. If utilized properly, rent and financial components, you can win in the negotiations. And by no means am I suggesting to overpay in rent or scratch and crawl for 10 cents a square foot off. We'll get to that component in a minute. But if you utilize property, it can help you win in the negotiations. But why is the office lease so important? So first off, it's the foundation of your practice. Location, location, location. The lease ties you to that location to ensure you can continue practicing there. No lease, no location, no patients. Investment and cost to build. So depending on what you're looking to build, the quality and where you specifically are, it can cost anywhere from $200 to $300 a square foot, if not more. If you're downtown San Francisco, there's union laws as well, significantly higher. The lease ties you to the location and ties you to your investment, which is the plumbing and the build out. Very difficult, expensive, and time consuming to move. Now I'm going to tell everyone this evening something that many of you may not know or may choose or try not to know is unfortunately the landlord knows your business in many cases better than you, in the sense of they know it's time consuming, again, expensive, and again, difficult to relocate the practice. So timing is critical when addressing any sort of renewal, expansion, transition planning, acquisitions, anything of that nature, very critical to know when to approach the landlord and address all of these items. We're going to touch on that further in a few minutes. But the lease is critical in the practice sale. It can make or break the sale of your practice. Would you prefer it works as an asset or as a liability? Now, what are the three key sellable components of your dental practice? First and foremost, your equipment. What's the depreciated value? Secondly, goodwill or your patience. Now, I asked this question in our course where, what does goodwill mean to you? And I get a number of answers. It's the patience, the active patience. It's the reputation of the doctor. It can factor in the patient attrition when the acquisition or the sale occurs. But how do you boil it down? What is that worth? To put a number on it and to quantify, it's the bottom line. What is it producing? What are its profits? And the third component in a practice appraisal is the lease agreement. Now, a question and a situation I always utilize in my seminars is, if I'm looking to sell my practice, it's been appraised for $1 million, I'm selling it for $1 million. If I'm looking to sell my practice, what percentage of that evaluation can the lease impact? Again, I'm looking to sell my practice for $1 million. It's been appraised. What percentage of that evaluation can the lease impact? And I know many of you, very common to my seminar, think it's 50% because that's what the pie chart shows. Now, it's not proportional at all, but the lease can impact 100% of that evaluation. And by no means am I trying to suggest that it's worth 100%, because it's not, but it can impact 100% of that evaluation, which I'll get to in a few minutes. Now, what should your lease do for you? First and foremost, it should provide fair and affordable financial terms. And I'm not just talking about rent. Rent is the obvious. That is the main core component. But there are other financial terms that you need to be very aware of in your lease. So many of you are on what's called a triple net lease, where there's an additional rent on top of rent, where you pay your proportionate share based on your taxes, insurance, and maintenance of the property. Now, many of you don't realize, particularly the maintenance aspect, is that many of you are overpaying on the maintenance component. Not to say all, but many. Many landlords utilize the maintenance and the common area maintenance component as a bit of a profit center. So what we do and insert into leases to ensure that there's full transparency in terms of what your money is going towards is to ensure that you're to receive detailed and itemized statements at the end of each year, outlining what the actual costs were and a breakdown of what expense occurred, when, and to whom. And you have the right to audit those and have your accountant review the books to ensure there's no funny business. Other items, if you're looking to expand, renovate, or start up a practice, items like free rent in a fixturing period. So the time where you don't have to pay rent when you're building out or renovating. Or when doors open, additional months of free rent. Many don't realize, but landlords will combine those to make it seem like you had a better deal than what you could have gotten. Tenant improvement allowance. More is not always better. So tenant improvement allowance is the money the landlord's willing to give you in order to help outfit the space. It's not free money. It is baked back into the rental rates you pay. Now, I'm not suggesting to take none, because it could be a good deal, but to know the evaluation that the landlord's putting on it, because it may be more beneficial to take a bigger loan out with, for example, Bank of America at a cheaper interest rate than it would be to take from the landlord. A long-term stability and security for the practice. So critical in most cases, not all, but most cases, if a doctor's not looking to relocate, we recommend a 10-year term with multiple 5-year options to renew. Reason being, A, gives you at least 20 years of predictability in the space and security. B, it's like buying in bulk. Typically, when you offer a longer term or more, you get a better deal. And thirdly, many don't realize, but in order to sell the practice, banks typically need 10 years of term left on the lease in order to finance an acquisition. Typically 10 years left on the lease, whether it's in the form of initial term or options, depending on your options, how they're structured, in order to finance an acquisition. So critical that that component is structured properly. Or for shorter flexibility if you have other plans to relocate the practice. Minimize risk and exposure. Many of you, whether you know it or not, have either personally signed the lease or have provided a personal guarantee. Is it reasonable? Common when you first start up a practice or a new tenant to a building. But is it fair to have one forever? Maximizing your flexibility. So incorporating in rights, for example, to right of first refusal to purchase or expand. So if the building ever were to go up for sale or a vacancy next door, you have first right to that space. Potential growth opportunity or investment opportunity. And finally, enhance your ability to sell the practice. Again, would you prefer your lease works as an asset or a liability? Now, what's in your... So we're going to go through a couple terms and conditions through your lease to give you a bit of an insight into some of the items to look out for. So this is an option to renew paragraph, where the option to renew is the option, but not the obligation to extend your lease further. And the landlord can't deny you. Now, the language here below is found in 90% of the leases we review. We review over 1,000 leases each year. Again, we represent a little over 500 doctors on an annual basis. This is found in 90% of them, and many of those negotiated by a quote-unquote dental-specific lease attorney. Now, I'll go through one of the items in this paragraph, and you may notice in the first sentence, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant. The issue with this is, if Dr. Joe Black sells the practice, the options to renew do not transfer to the buyer, meaning Dr. Black has to commit to 10 years today in order to sell the practice and transfer the lease. Not ideal. Now, landlords became crafty. Dr. Joe Black can be very obvious or seen as obvious, although it is missed regularly. Some will say along the lines of, as long as the original tenant occupies the space and things of that nature. Now, that's just one major issue within this lease, or within this provision, rather. There are many others. There was a doctor last year in March who had conditionally sold her practice. Herself and an attorney had negotiated a 5-year term with a 5-year option to renew exclusive to her. The condition on the sale was that the option transferred to the buyer because they needed the 10 years for financing. So she went to her landlord, as per her lease, to ask for consent and to ask for the option to transfer to the buyer. The landlord wrote her a letter back. She sent us the letter for her opinion, and it stated, Happy to consent to this amendment of the lease and change for $120,000. Now she asked, is this ethical? This can't be allowed. This is extortion. And fortunately, it's what she agreed to. The landlord could really ask for any number. Very, very important to know exactly what's in your lease. The assignment and subletting section of your lease. So the assignment component outlines the transferability of your lease in the event that you look to sell the practice. Now, this language is found in 75% of the dental leases we review. So typically, in our seminar, we would go through it in a much slower fashion. So if you do have any questions, please utilize the question and answer section that is on the webinar. Happy to address some of those more specific ones as well. But we'll walk through this. So in terms of the first potentially problematic component, you'll notice it states if the tenant should wish to assign or sublet the leased premises, it shall first have received the consent of the landlord. Meaning, you need the landlord's permission in order to sell the practice and transfer the lease. Very common in commercial real estate. What's unusual about this is it just states that you need the consent of the landlord. Many have it structured where it states which consent shall not be unreasonably withheld and believes that protects them just from having that. The unfortunate part is, what's the definition of unreasonable? Now, for those of you who have seen one of our in-person seminars or webinars, one of our more extreme situations that we've been of recently has a doctor who had been in his space for well over 30 years, was quote unquote family friends with his landlord, patient of his. He conditionally sold his practice, predicated on his lease transfer. So as per his lease, he went to his landlord, quote unquote family friend, for consent, and the landlord said happy to, on one of three conditions. One, the rent is increased 35%. Two, they paid him 50% of the sale proceeds, 50. Or three, the landlord was going to terminate the lease. What would you do? I can tell you they're not family friends anymore. There's some choice words to be had, but very, very critical to know how your consent is structured and what that process is. Now it goes on to say, any request for such consent shall be in writing. Within 15 days following receipt by the landlord of such request for consent, the landlord shall have the option to, one, approve tenant's request and assign the lease or sublet the premises. Two, decline the tenant's request to assign the lease or sublet the premises. Or three, to terminate the lease agreement upon the effective date of such proposed lease, assignment, or sublet. One, approve. Two, decline. Or three, terminate. What would you do if they declined? Continue practicing? What would you do if they were to terminate your lease? What would your practice be worth if there was no location? I can tell you there'll be some value for the patient charts, equipment, but it's no longer turnkey practice. Significantly devalues. Additionally, should the landlord consent to the assignment or sublet of the premises, the landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid to the remainder of the term to the then greater of the current market rent or 15% greater than the then current rent. Essentially meaning when the lease is assigned, your rent is going up at least 15%. Now, it may not be as much of a concern of you in terms of rent, but how does that impact the practice sale? If the buyer finds that out, could they walk away? Now the evaluation's off. Could they ask you for a discount because now their rent's greater, profits are lower? Furthermore, should the tenant receive from the assignee or subtenant any rental income, cash, goods, or any form of consideration in connection with the assignment of this lease or sublet of the premises that is over and above the current base rental rates payable to the landlord in any fiscal year during the term of this lease, the difference between the annual rental rate and such rental income, cash, goods, or other considerations will be paid to the landlord directly within 30 days of the tenant's receipt thereof. Essentially what this means is the landlord is getting a percentage of the sale proceeds, of your hard-earned profits. In reality, they should be receiving zero. But having sale profits or proceeds would be too obvious. So many utilize the word consideration or cash, things of that nature. Finally, notwithstanding the landlord's consent to any assignment or subletting, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant of the lease. Now, I'm not sure if anyone noticed what this is called is continuous liability. So even after sale, you still remain liable for the lease obligations. And if you've signed the lease personally as well as your corporation, that's both entities. You notice there's no expiry either. So if they keep renewing the lease, you continue to be liable. Very, very important that you understand what is in your lease. Now, those are just two provisions within your lease. There are dozens and dozens more, not limited to what's on the screen right now. There are many others, but these are some of the more common ones. So a demolition clause or redevelopment clause, where the landlord has the ability to terminate your lease in the event they look to redevelop the property. Typically, it's structured, if not negotiated, on a 30 days notice. Relocation provision, so to relocate the practice to another space on the property, and typically you have to pay for it. Or financial statements, where the landlord has the ability to ask you for your financial statements, and not just the business. If you've personally signed or have a personal guarantee, that's both a business and you personally. How comfortable are you providing your personal financial statements? Or death and disability provision, which is typically missing from a lease. It's really how we got our name 26 years ago, where God forbid something were to happen and you're no longer able to practice. What happens to the lease? Now, we alluded to it earlier.
This just a quick update from the moderator here. So we've seen a full, looks like we've struck a nerve on that, Ryan. So lots of good questions as a result, asking about timing for renewals and questions about rental rates and whatnot for their specific area or building. And in short, yes, there will be the option at the end of the webinar to request a complimentary lease review. And I would encourage you, we are going to get to Q&A shortly. Please use the Q&A function. And we'll have some good conversations at the end of the webinar. Back to you, Ryan.
So the tenant lease cycle. So a question I typically get is, when do I start? When's the optimal time? The optimal time is 24 months prior to your lease expiry. So 2 years prior to your lease expires, the perfect time and optimal time where you have maximum leverage in the negotiations for a few reasons. So one, it takes at least 18 to 24 months to properly relocate a practice. Now, depending on where you are in California or Hawaii, there's certain areas that it takes upwards of 3 to 4 years. I know dentists who are still looking 5 years later for a space to relocate to. There's just no vacancy and no availability. So critical that as much time as possible prior to, typically the threshold's 24 months. This gives you ample time to negotiate and see what they're willing to offer prior to not only your lease expiry, but particularly to your option to renew deadline. So if you're starting, whether it's 3, 6, 9 months out, you're well behind, because very similarly, the landlord knows you can't or don't want to relocate the practice. It's expensive. 24 months ahead gives them the perception that if they're not giving you a good deal, you have the potential to relocate the practice. At least 24 months. If we do have anyone on the webinar today that their lease has either expired and is on a month-to-month basis, whereupon 30 days notice you or the landlord can terminate your lease, or if you are coming up for expiry or to your option to renew deadline, we need to address that immediately. And if you're not sure what your option to renew deadline is or your lease, we need to find that out ASAP. Now, we do have a question here as well. So you had mentioned that it's fair to have personal guarantees forever. Is there an alternate structure? Thank you. So there is. So in terms of that component, whether it's initially or upon the renewal after you've shown covenant as a tenant, to either ideally, depending on your property, the area, and the practice, there is potential to have a release of personal liability and only have your corporate entity as part of it. The second component is creating some sort of limitation. So some landlords negotiate for the sake of negotiating. And it's not a matter of yes and no, it's a matter of where. So creating some sort of limitation, whether it's some sort of expiry, cap on monetary value, or some sort of blend. But it is not fair to constantly have a personal guarantee. Just common initially, as they don't know you as a tenant. Now, critical dates analysis. So essentially a lease review. This is one of the services that we provide. It's essentially $1,500 or $1,495. And essentially what happens is an economic and legal analysis of your lease, where a leasing team completes their due diligence on rental rates, comparables, as well as our proprietary data, while our legal team goes through the legal terms and provisions in detail, so highlighting the risks, exposures, liabilities. We then schedule a call with the doctor. It's typically about an hour long. We go through their goals, their visions for the practice, what they're looking to do. We go through the lease and how it can impact them based on that plan, and essentially a treatment plan for it. Now, thank you to our sponsors today, again, Bank of America and Henry Schein. They've actually covered the costs for all registrants and attendees today to receive their lease review and lease consultation complimentary. So whether you're looking to start up a practice, acquire a practice, renew your lease, transition, potentially expand, or you own the space that you practice out of, this can be very important to you to learn about it. If you do not have a lease, we schedule a call with you to walk you through some of the different plans you have. So if you're looking to start up or acquire, walk you through what to expect, what to look out for, and some of the different tips and tricks to utilize for that. If you do have lease documents, what I will need is your original lease, including any extensions, amendments, estoppel certificates. So if your building's been sold or refinanced, it's typically 1 to 3 pages, or an assignment agreement if you've purchased the practice. All of those are needed for the lease consultation, as they all refer to each other. So I want to thank everybody for joining the course this evening. I know it's been a long day, a lot of content. If you do have any questions, please utilize the question answer section. If you have any specific questions about your situation, your landlord, how you can utilize the time right now through COVID and some of the different aspects that landlords are utilizing or not utilizing thereafter as well, and how you can really take advantage of this time. Let us know. Schedule your lease, or have any questions in general, email the info at, as you'll see below, or call the toll-free number there below, and happy to answer whether it's any questions you have or to schedule in your complimentary lease consultation as well. So we have a few questions here.
And as we do, as mentioned, we'll launch a quick poll. So everyone now should have a poll in front of them. So please take a quick moment, and then we'll get to the Q&A. Presently, with a lease in place today, number 2 is, when does your lease currently expire? Number 3 is, we will prioritize review based on urgency. I see there's a number of urgency ones coming through. Number 4, if you are interested in either the rent analysis, as Ryan showed some examples of, vacancies in your specific area, rental rates, vacancies. And then number 5 is, if you're looking at things from that Rockefeller perspective and looking to expand or make some investments into your current space, or potentially start or buy a new practice. I see a few dozen so far. Please take a quick minute, and then we'll get to some Q&A. And then also, there'll be an additional option afterwards where you can specifically request a time and request the lease review there as well. We'll keep the polls open for another minute. As Ryan mentioned, there's also the Q&A open. Number of questions coming through now as well. We'll keep the polls open for another minute or so everyone has an update to open. And Ryan, a couple of key questions now. Looks based on some damage and destruction, as well as, again, some key questions about some of our process and pricing structures.
So in terms of the initial question, it's referencing a practice. Their practice was unfortunately burned down. I am sorry to hear. They're almost 6 months since the event and want to sign a new lease with their landlord, as there is a clause that releases them from a lease when they cannot rebuild in time. So this is referring to the damage and destruction clause in your lease. So depending on how it's structured, so if it, assuming, you know, what you told me again, it's easier when I've reviewed the full section on all components, because sometimes it can have other references in other parts of the lease that supersede certain components. But assuming that there is some sort of release, there can be an opportunity to renegotiate, or depending on when your lease was going to expire. Again, very similar situation. If there's limited time left on the lease, or there's this particular opportunity here because there's a potential release, absolutely an advantage there to take advantage of the situation, particularly as it may help you if there's additional time out. I was just working with another doctor on the similar situation. She was actually out just about a year, but this will help take advantage and maybe additional rent-free or other components as well. But it really depends in terms of the full overarching strategy, what all of the provisions of the lease state, because some will reference back to the damage and destruction provision that may supersede that as well. So in terms of the next question, what is the price structure for lease negotiations? And there's a number of different, I guess, structures. Really depends on the scope of the work. So through the complimentary lease consultation also gives us an opportunity to review the scope of work, what needs to be done, assisted to, or maybe lack thereof if there's not much to do as well, because it's already structured properly. It gives us an idea of what the scope of work is. So that it really depends on that. We'll know once we've been able to review the lease and discuss your situation with you. Very similarly, also, how receptive are landlords to your negotiations? Very. landlords actually expect there to be representation. It's interesting because I received this I don't know whether it's a comment or a question, but landlords expect it. When they see a dentist who's not being represented or represented properly, they lick their chops, because what they see is someone who doesn't know the ins and outs of commercial real estate, how it works, and all of the nuances with it. So for your protections, that's why, first and foremost, you should have someone professional representing you. And secondly, we know how to talk to them because we know what they want. Everyone thinks, what's in it for me? What's in it for the landlord is a good tenant. Dentists last year had a default rate on their loans of 0.7%. 0.7%. That means you don't default. And I can assure you, as many of you have seen in your plazas, many of the other types of businesses, the jumbo juice and so forth, in many cases have unfortunately gone under. Yet dental practices are still progressing through. Your long-standing tenants, you invest a significant amount of money in the space, and you pay your rent on time and every month. That's what landlords love. That's where your value to the negotiations are. So everything that we're talking about in the negotiations is not unreasonable, where the landlord's going to say, take a hike. So I never recommend or suggest to our clients, unless it's absolutely necessary, which is rare, where, for example, we should have half the rent. Because in the reality, the landlord is going to be annoyed with that. So it's particularly the strategy that we develop is why, one, landlords are receptive to it, but two, we're so successful at it and have been doing it for the 26 years. So the next, pardon?
A couple of additional questions in the chat as well about opening another practice within about a mile radius of where they're at today.
So in terms of a different question, how do I know what is a fair lease rate in a building that is not a Class A? Also, how do I know what class level of a building? So it's great, completing due diligence. So our in-house leasing team have access to rental rates and comparables in any given market, whether it's a particular and specific building, an area. We have all of that data to, one, be able to tell you if it's a Class A or B. You'll be able to I'm sure, find potentially something online and so forth in terms of the class. In terms of what's fair in the area, that's all part of the due diligence process. So that's how it's determining and analyzing what like type of businesses are paying in the area. So that's part of our leasing team's specialization, is having access to those rates and comparables. So one question is, how different is the complimentary review from the $1,500 service? No difference. So it's the exact same. You're receiving it complimentary, courtesy of Henry Schein and Bank of America. So if you have a local rep at either one, be sure to thank them. So the next question is, how has COVID changed the landscape? With other tenants leaving, doesn't this make it harder to negotiate? Quite the opposite. If tenants are leaving, that increases the vacancy, so increases the supply, decreases the demand. And if they have a tenant such as yourself that's looking to extend the lease, that's gravy to them. That is absolutely what they're looking for. So that primes you to get a better deal. So 100% in this market right now is the optimal time to take advantage of it. So a number of projects we're working on right now are particularly expansion projects where they've been busting at the seams for years, but haven't had the ability to expand the practice because the tenant next door has always been there. that tenant is no longer there. Now they have the opportunity to expand, and the landlord's motivated to get a secured tenant. Essentially, you're paying more rent, but less on a per square foot basis because you're taking up more space. Again, it's like buying in bulk. The more you buy, the better deal you get. So another question here. So another practice is 4 years into a 10-year lease. Is there any possibility for negotiation? Potentially, a little bit more of a stretch. So unless typically there's some sort of expansion opportunity that you're looking to do, transition, or if the landlord's in a particular situation, some will look to extend early. I would say not common, but happens in rare cases. In terms of that, we'd be able to help provide and provide a little more to that through the lease review and lease consultation, but I don't want to say it's common. It's fairly uncommon unless there's specific variables at play. Now, there are a few more questions here. It is just a little after now, so what we'll do here is if you do have any more specific questions, I see some specific for situations, keeping them a little bit more open for it. So if you do have any questions, please let us know as well. Send an email to the info at, give us a call, and as well schedule your complimentary lease review, and we can go through any questions or your situation more specifically. So whether it's you just have questions in general, you would like a rental rate analysis, so comparing your fair market rents to yourself in the area, or if you'd like the full lease consultation where we review your lease in detail, update on rental rates and comparables, and obviously address any questions as well along the way, let us know. What we'll need for the lease consultation component is a copy of your original lease, including extensions, amendments, estoppel certificates, or assignment agreements as well. If you're looking for the rental rate analysis, we will need your lease to determine the rents in the area and the property, and the escalations and so forth to give you proper feedback on that, on the escalations, the rents, and any other financial components for it. If you have any questions, obviously we can just coordinate time from there as well. But it's been a pleasure. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening and look forward to speaking with you very soon. Take care.
Thank you everyone for attending. I see there's one or two additional questions in the chat. Patrick, two other general questions here. Should I open a practice within a mile? And also what to do if your lease is up in 2 years and the landlord is refusing to enter into negotiations. So definitely, Patrick, worthwhile discussing and reviewing that lease, seeing if there's any options remaining, seeing where you're at with the current situation for the practice. But in short, it can be up to 18 months to relocate a practice in Hawaii or on the mainland throughout California. So the more time you have, the more leverage. And in actuality, most landlords are very responsive to a proposal. If you ask them, hey, I'd like to renew, of course they're going to shoo you away. But part of our strategy is to be proactive and come forth with a proposal to engage the landlord to renew and start the process early, right? The more time you have, the more leverage, the more time they can defer, deflect, and delay you as much as possible, the worse it will be. So those are two extra ones there. Lots of great positive feedback, Ryan. Thank you, Dan, for the positive feedback here. Thank you for the great feedback. Any other additional questions? Perfect. Again, thank you so much, Ryan, for a great presentation this evening. Thank you all for attending and looking forward to connecting. There will be another option and link at the end to, again, help register for the upcoming review. Thank you very much. Have a great night.